Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to moderate this panel, AI fairness testing, making it work in the real world. And if I have to rephrase it, we might say fairness in AI Act also. There is this additional AI Act thing that will be at the table also. And it's organized by Uber. I think I will first, I'm very honored to have this wonderful list of panelists because, as you can see from our background, we are all diverse, and I think this is extremely necessary for a fairness discussion to have very different background, and also in terms of skills that the panelists can bring to the table. So I will rapidly introduce them. First, we have Kai Zenner. Kai is the head of office of the member of European Parliament, Axel Voss at the European Parliament, and leading also on the AI Act files. Then Dan Svirsky, a data scientist at Uber. Sophia Ignatidou, Group Manager AI and Data Science at the Information and Commissioner's Office, the UK Data Protection Agency, for people that don't know it. And Olivia Gambelin, AI ethicist and founder of Ethical Intelligence. Thank you all for being here. So the topic of today, as you can see and can understand, has two big keywords: fairness, AI. But of course, fairness can have many different interpretations, many different applications. And I think that everyone, if I ask just give me a synonyms of fairness in this room, we would have 82 different synonyms, right? Or maybe not so many, but referring to very different concepts based on the background. So just to say that fairness now has also different across different legal sectors. We have a concept of fairness in consumer protection. We have a concept of fairness in data protection. We have a concept of fairness in contractual law. And we are going to have, hopefully, the AI Act that also has different declinations of the word fairness. So I would start with Kai Zenner to ask him about the last developments in terms of the AI Act, if he can, just to update us, because these very days are extremely hot for the calendar and before the trialogue, etc., and how the fairness concept came in the room. The Parliament added this, and I'm very curious to hear how the AI Act now sees fairness.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. Always good to come. So, to your first question. Indeed, the Parliament finally, after I think it was 42 technical meetings, around 12 shadows meetings on a political level, came to a conclusion on committee level. So the plenary vote is still outstanding. And it was extremely harsh because the perspectives among the political groups and even within the political groups on AI, but also on fairness, on basically every element of the AI Act are so diverse and similar to your statement of different interpretations of the word fairness. But yeah, now we finally managed it. It was a very, very tight compromise in the end, very difficult to swallow for everyone. So we lost a lot of important points. The Social Democrats lost a lot of important points and so on. But in the end, I think, yeah, first of all, we are all relieved. We are all kind of happy that we did the Mission Impossible, kind of. And now looking forward to the trialogue. And in the trialogue, maybe to give a little bit of a hint, I see especially Article 5, so the prohibitions, the bans of certain AI technologies, as a major problem, because the Council has very law enforcement friendly approaches in most member states. For example, the Spanish presidency or France now with Olympia, they want to use the technology whatever is possible. And then, of course, we have a strong majority in the parliament. Our group is not part of it, but basically all other political groups that really want a very strong ban in this area. Another point that we actually discussed shortly in our prep talk is, of course, foundation models, general purpose AI systems, of course, and the chatbots like ChatGPT, like BART, and so on, something that is conceptually not really fitting in the AI Act. And therefore is now the big question, do we include it, like now the Parliament proposed it, or do we leave it out? Mrs. Vestager was indicating something like this, and either addressing this problem on an international level or with even a new law or whatsoever. And the third point, I think we come later also in this area, is enforcement. There are a lot of problems that are already rather visible that will come. Maybe we will repeat certain mistakes that we did with the GDPR. And yeah, those three things will keep us busy until December. And we need to finish in December in order to really adopt the law before the election. And now quickly also to the second part of your question on fairness. Yes, of course, as you can imagine, for many groups in the parliament, fairness, anti-discrimination, being against bias and so on is really one of the key pillars of their political objectives when it comes to AI. And therefore, there was a big push to bring it in. We as EPP were, of course, from the beginning rather skeptical because we didn't want to have something too broad, for example, in Article 10 on data sets, which would then lead to situations that we have a general ban of, for example, biased data sets, which would mean, for example, in the medical area, if you are developing drugs, you need an biased data set sometimes if you are making a drug for pregnant women, for example. And therefore, we needed to find a little bit language that is concrete enough, but also general enough to find the middle ground. We took in the end the definition of fairness and discrimination and so on from the high-level expert group, and we have it in this new Article 4a, which is kind of general principles for the AI Act, and then you find it also in Article 10 that I said already, and Article 13 is a part, but also in the risk assessment in Article 9, and so on and so on. So you see it in very different stages. What is then the concrete interpretation of the word fairness, and more details that unfair, biased, and not discriminatory? This will be decided on the level of standardization and guidance and guidelines. So we need, in a EU law, we need to keep it broad and general. We cannot go too deep into detail.
Wonderful. So I think now we have a clearer view, because actually this was a novelty of the Parliament to add these principles. So just to summarize, now we have fairness among the principles as a general interpretational principle maybe, but the AI Act keeps this view on bias mitigation, bias correction at Article 10. Of course, this is an interpretation of fairness based on non-discrimination, etc. There might be other, of course, ways, and we will explore them. But, you know, we discuss about interpretations, but actually fairness is also operationalized. And so I'm very happy to have a data scientist at the table that can show us how fairness testing, fairness practice is actually operationalized at the level of a big company, also very much digitalized. So I wanted to ask you, how does actually fairness testing works for now? I mean, the pros, the cons, the limits, the challenges?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So my team is called the Marketplace Fairness Team, and what we do is test to make sure that race or systemic racism doesn't infect AI or the technology. So we test for that and try to mitigate that. But there are real limits to this work, and sometimes I feel like the more I do it, the less I feel I know. And there's two limits specifically that are very fundamental and I want to talk about. And one I describe as a translation problem, and one I describe as a flashlight problem. Before diving into it, I do always want to say, when I do a fairness test, I'm looking at rows of data and columns. And I get excited talking about the statistics, and I find the job really interesting. But each row is a human. Each row could be one of the more painful moments of somebody's life. So I do, want to acknowledge that and say that before I kind of dive in and get excited. And that's actually relevant for the first problem, the translation problem. We have to translate lived experience into a data set that I can use to test. This is easier said than done, and a lot gets lost in translation. So one very fundamental, important example is if you want to know if there are disparities against vulnerable groups, you need some definition of who's in a vulnerable group. You have to take somebody's identity, turn it into a categorical variable. And that makes me nervous. First of all, from the US Census in 2020, we see this more than doubling in the amount of people who identify with more than one race. How should that change fairness testing? I think it's an open question I'd like to see more academic work on. Interestingly, part of that change reflects different demographics. Part of it reflects a change in wording. So when I'm trying to find out who's in a vulnerable group, that question depends on which day I ask them, who's asking them, why they're being asked. All these things can affect the data set, and that's what I need to rely on to do the testing. And also importantly, I've come to realize, and maybe this is obvious, but just that these groups, they're not one thing, they're a bundle of things. So especially in the US, the way people are racialized, the way that race comes across, it depends on your name. It depends on how you look, how you have your hair, where you live in space, which obviously at Uber we think a lot about. And sometimes some of these may be the mechanism by which discrimination happens, sometimes not. But when we do the tests, we need to think hard about the lived experience, what's happening underneath, so that we can interpret the data better. The second problem is the flashlight problem. And what I mean by that is I feel like I'm kind of wandering in the dark sometimes, trying to point my flashlight to find problems. Like, this is the world of things I want to test, and this is what I end up testing. There are real limits, right? So I'm interested in different vulnerable groups. So are Black drivers facing discrimination? I'm interested in whether female drivers are facing safety incidents or discrimination. So I obviously want to know about the experience of Black female drivers. I worry about drivers with disabilities. Which types of disabilities? It could be hard of hearing, mobility issues, cognitive limitations. So then I worry about how those interact with gender and race, but you could see the permutations get really big right away, and we have to pick and choose. This happens statistically too. So if I want to look at some outcome, like how long it takes to get a car, well, when do I look? Do I look at last week? Do I look at 2020, during the pandemic, before? Those times seem less relevant, but reasonable people could disagree. What do I control for? Do I look at airport trips, or are they too different than what I'm interested in? With the statistical model, do I have, the term is fixed effects for the hour. Do I think the hour level matters, the week? Which cities do I look at? They're all reasonable choices, but reasonable people could end up with different conclusions about what the best thing is to do. So I think when it comes back around to me, I'll talk about best practices and what I'm hoping to see from regulation. But I'll pause there now, and I'll just say, in spite of the limitations, which are very real and I like to highlight, sometimes I see companies use the limitations as an excuse not to do the testing, and I think that's very frustrating. So when I approach this work, how I try to think of it to myself is that the limits should give me a sense of humility, but not of cynicism. Doing the testing in all its limitations is better than not doing it.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, if fairness is difficult, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And I'm super triggered by your reference to vulnerability, because this is a topic it's very dear to me. Yesterday we had this panel on how we define vulnerable groups. Are they groups or not? And then the problem of computing different factors, because you mentioned female, black, drivers. This is intersectional discrimination, but how you compute multidimensional, there is a whole world. But we mentioned the AI Act as one possible way to help for debiasing AI, etc. Still, we have something that is data protection that already has fairness principle that can be declined as non-discrimination, but also beyond. There are many possible interpretations. I'm very happy that we have a data protection authority at the table, and in particular the ICO, because I thought it's called ICO resource, but it's not the guidelines. So basically the ICO released these guidelines on fairness in AI, and I'm very curious to hear how data protection can inform this discussion about fairness in AI. Is it enough? Your work was taken from the GDPR or developing more, so.
Thank you, Gianclaudio. And I think what I'm going to talk about is actually plugging into what Dan was explaining in terms of translating concepts and what fairness means. So the ICO initially published its guidance on AI data protection back in 2020. Professor Ruben Beans was the author for that. But following calls from stakeholders, but also because of internal operational needs, we realized we really needed to expand on what we're saying in terms of fairness in data protection, and more specifically when it comes to AI. So in March this year, we published a fairness update to our existing guidance on AI data protection. And we try to fulfill two main objectives. So the first one was we try to operationalize what fairness means by setting out a roadmap that essentially mentions provisions across the legislation that relate explicitly or implicitly to fairness. So it's not just about Article 5 that explicitly mentions fairness, but it's also about other provisions like transparency, for example, is really fundamental for fairness. The requirement to conduct a data protection impact assessment also ensures that organizations who process your personal data are actually considering the outcomes of that processing on you, and therefore hopefully mitigating any unfair outcomes. It also, fairness in data protection also relates to Article 22 and the need to put the requirement for human oversight and the opportunity for a data subject to challenge a decision if that decision is significant or legal and they think that it's unfair. But also, Recital 71 explicitly mentions discrimination in relation essentially to special category data. So there are different provisions across legislation that underpin fairness. And the second objective we try to fulfill with the guidance is answer to the needs of data scientists, basically, because we realize that we cannot expect data scientists to become data protection experts, but at the same time, we need to provide a roadmap for them and actually flag data protection considerations across the AI lifecycle. So we have a new section that takes readers through the lifecycle and talks about aspects of AI development that will have a downstream impact on fairness. And that begins from how you formulate your problem when you're trying to take a real life problem and make it a computable one, all these things that Dan was mentioning before. The assumptions you're making in terms of the relationship between your features and the outcomes you're trying to predict. The abstraction, because by the process of making a problem a computable one, you're actually, necessarily so, you will have to omit certain features. And we kind of urge developers to consider whether or not certain features are actually fundamental to actually solving your problem and therefore lead to fair results. And also other aspects like the exploration vs exploitation aspect of model development. So we tried it to kind of like address the data scientists and make them understand how data protection, fairness, and provisions within it relate to the different stages of model development. And I think one of the main kind of like incentives for the guidance was to make people understand how data protection principles and the framework as a whole is still relevant in an AI context. And I think it's a really good like baseline. And I think, and we also try to kind of like mitigate the danger of people thinking that fairness is only about distribution. So it's not just about discrimination. It's not about, you know, your rates of true positives or your statistical accuracy. It is, in terms of data protection, fairness is also about the power, information, and balance between organizations who process your data and you, which is slightly different than just discrimination. And also we kind of like try to highlight dangers with you know, using and developing AI. We have to remember that machine learning models are statistical approximations. Therefore, and you know, hopefully they're generalizable. Otherwise, you will not use those models. But any model will have certain outliers, and these are data subjects that are minority in your training data sets, but still. You know, Article 22, for example, is not something that does not apply if someone is an outlier. So you have to kind of like consider that in your process. I think I've talked too much, actually, so I'm going to just pause here and just going to finish by saying that the key takeaway we're hoping people will have after reading the guidance is that fairness is not static. You do need to monitor the outcomes of your processing. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah. Incredibly interesting, because actually we saw how data protection alone already contains so many angles, and also I think it's very interesting to bring at the table the point that fairness is not just discrimination, but is rebalancing power imbalancing, mitigate imbalances, mitigating vulnerabilities. And all these open a lot to the ethics scenario, because these are all connected to how fairness is also an ethical concept under different possible interpretations. One thing we said, and I think we all said, the difficulty is to go from principles to practice. And Olivia, you did it. I mean, you tried to do with your exactly. You tried to do it with also with your clients, etc. How basically to go from principle to practice. And so I'm curious to see, how do you see from governance to technical level, fairness?
Absolutely, and something to start off here is there is a difference between compliance and ethics. There is law and oops, sorry, I've got a little closer, there we go. There is a difference between legal and ethics, and it's a very important difference to understand. There is an automatic default often that happens of, I'm ethical because I follow the law. That's not true. You can be perfectly legal and very unethical. Oftentimes, I will tell my clients when they're saying, oh, we're compliant, I tell them, great, now you can go tell your customers that you're not illegal. That's all you can claim. You can't claim that you're ethical. There is a difference, but why does that matter? Why does it matter that we have the difference between the legal and the ethics side? Well, ethics really, in the case of fairness, is how your customers are perceiving your actions as the company. So if you are compliant, but a feature, for example, feels discriminatory to your end users, your users aren't going to care that you're compliant. Your users are still going to say that they are not being treated fairly. So this is where some of that difference comes in. Ethics is important, just as important as law. Law is the great perfect foundation to then build off of. And what this means actually in practice, when we're moving these principles such as fairness into practice, is really looking at 3 different layers. One of the first layers is technology. And Dan, I absolutely loved what you were talking about in your 2 examples, because on a technical level, that is exactly what you are looking at in terms of understanding how we're putting fairness into action. But there are 2 more layers going here. The second layer above the technical level is process. That's where we're looking at governance. So you can have different metrics, different fairness metrics that you're checking for, but when are those being checked for? What metrics are you using? What are your comparisons? I've worked with teams before where there were 3 different teams of data scientists, and each data scientist in each of these teams, they were teams of 10, were using different metrics. And they were trying to figure out, well, according to this metric, we're reaching this fairness metric, but we're not reaching it over here, and the teams weren't talking to each other. And so although they were trying to practice fairness in action, they had no process set up, no process established, one that coincided with their workflow so that they were able to really bring that fairness to life. And the last layer after process is people. People do matter. The people that are building our technology do matter, and it's important that they understand the importance of fairness, but also the definition. So we can't move any fairness, any concept of fairness into action in our technology until we actually have it defined and understand it as people. And our teams are operating on the same definition of fairness. You can have fairness of equal opportunity versus equal outcome versus equal quality of service. All of these are valid definitions of fairness, and there's no right answer. What is the right thing to do, though, is have a solid definition that you're operating on that you can use as comparison. That provides clarity and starts moving those principles into practice. And I'll leave with one more, well, I'll end with one more little point here, is before we even reach the technology, and I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of what Dan was saying here about when you're looking at data sets and recognizing that it's people on the other end, the bias that we see in our systems is bias that is rooted in our society. So before we can fix our systems, how are we actually understanding what needs to be fixed on a societal level that is being echoed into our data?
Great. I think the many examples you made are very relevant for the implementation of the existing law, the GDPR, and the new proposed AI Act, because we really saw how not only the complexity, but also the goals influence the process. And the goals might be, as you said, distributive justice, equality of opportunities, etc. And the data protection is a bit, like a window for many things. So I would like to go back to the lawyers at the table to ask, how do you see this discussion? How do you react to this discussion, looking in particular at the intersection between GDPR, AI Act, or other AI regulations beyond Europe? So maybe first Kai, and then Sophia on this point.
Yeah, I will answer on that question in different layers. So we have indeed, you indicated it already, now as European Parliament added one point that civil society was demanding from the Parliament to put in the fundamental rights impact assessment in Article 29A. And there I'm speaking now on personal capacity. My political group doesn't like it very much. I do understand, let's say, on a personal level, the reasoning behind it, because you have a high-risk AI system as a provider, let's say SAP, the German software company, developing it for employment purposes. They do not 100% know how it's in the end being deployed. They have a feeling, of course, what are, for example, certain biases, how it's about transparency and so on and so on. But indeed, proponents for this fundamental right impact assessment have a good point that it's in the end the deployer who really has a feeling about the context, about the situation per se. Now, going back a little bit to party line, EPP, where we have a little bit the problems with this proposal, and there was a kind of 50-50 split in the parliament, is to make it work again in practice, so something we discussed now before, and also not to overburden, especially the smaller market players, but not only companies, but also researchers, maybe the state, and the state is not always the federal state or federal level, but maybe also a city level and so on, because if really the objective of the AI Act, or one of the objectives, is also to promote the deployment of AI, we should not make it too difficult. And then we were going really into the details of this new fundamental rights impact assessment. And there, for example, is one element that is asking everyone to do a public consultation before using the AI system. And now, going to my SME example, or a startup in Bavaria, for example, with 20 people, they are investing everything they have, of course, in making the system work, or in this case, deploying the system, making a nice service for the customer, and so on. And they will not have the resources to do a full-fledged public consultation. So this maybe as one of the examples where we still need to do a little bit of work as Parliament, and I need to say I'm very curious how the Council will react on that. My feeling is they will strongly push back. But let's see how much we as Parliament secure of this fundamental rights impact assessment in the end. We need to make sure, again, that it's doable for everyone. Maybe we need to use different layers, that, for example, a big tech corporation needs to do it full-fledged, a smaller market player reduced, or we make a split between private use and public use. No idea. What is good, and now I'm coming to the GDPR, is that we were indeed recognizing that there are huge overlaps between GDPR and AI Act, especially when it comes to the risk assessment, which is also overlapping with the data protection impact assessment, Article 35 GDPR, but now also the new fundamental right impact assessment, which has a lot of elements that are already in the data protection impact assessment. So what we did in the new paragraph 6 and in the paragraph 4, we included language which is saying that if you as a user of an AI system, because the AI system uses personal data, also need to do a DPIA, you can use the DPIA and just add certain elements that the AI Act is obliging you to also execute. And we also added other parts where we hope that especially smaller players can basically use all their knowledge that they have already collected now in the last years with the GDPR. And maybe on that point, my last layer that I shortly wanted to say something about, there is really the big issue about enforcement. And let's start now with, for example, the company. I think many companies need to think about, do I need a new DPO kind of person for the AI Act, so someone who is really taking care that the company, especially on deployer level, is able to fulfill all the obligations that are now coming. Then the big question with guidance and guidelines and standards, one of the, in my view, things that went terribly wrong with the GDPR, maybe and hopefully there the Commission, the national competent authorities are a little bit faster, and I'm looking to our UK friends. I always admire them, how much they are reaching out to stakeholders and so on. This would be also one hope that I have, that in the AI Act we are learning that we should include the full range of stakeholders to really make those standards and guidelines work. And then the last point, and then I really stop, where hopefully we learn from, learn from GDPR flaws, is really different interpretations, what you said at the beginning again. So if we have then a situation in the end that not only fairness and all those elements are differently interpreted in Poland, others, and in Germany and Australia, and so on, we will have again a terrible situation, not only for the civil society, also for researchers and companies. And there we hope that with more harmonization and streamlining and maybe a more powerful AI office, we will be able to learn from those past mistakes and in the end make it really work, the system of GDPR, AI Act, but also all the other acts that are currently in discussion or recently adopted.
Now I'm in a very difficult situation and position because I would like to comment on everything you said, but I can't. I can just say that getting from Dan, if things are complex, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do that. So I think that the Parliament proposal is already very balanced in limiting for small entities, for SMEs. So there's a lot. But I liked a lot this ping pong between similar terms between AI Act and GDPR, DPIA, FRIA, DPO, AIO, I don't know if I can call it. How do you see the link between the two sets of law, the AI Act and GDPR, also considering that the AI Act would not apply to you, so as UK? So I'm very curious to hear about your view, and rapid, because then we want to open for discussion.
Yeah, I mean, like, it will not apply to us as a regulator, but it will apply to UK-based entities that will want to export their AI systems to the EU market, obviously. So there's a tension in terms of that. Quickly, yes, I do see the EU AI Act and GDPR as complementary. In a sense, the EU AI Act really empowers GDPR compliance as well, I would say. I'm not sure to what extent European DPAs will become the national competent authorities for the Act. I think that's a good approach that will avoid any duplication of, the DPOs, kind of like question you just raised. And also, I would expect DPAs to already have capacity in terms of understanding AI. And there are lots of points across the EU AI Act that I really, really like, and I think they speak to data protection principles, actually, but I'm not going to go through the list because we don't have any time. Handing back to you, Gianclaudio.
Thank you. So I'm curious to hear now from the non-lawyers, how do you see this dialogue feasible? This discussion that we had now, like impact assessment and principles, also looking at the possible developments of the law, so indeed the many provisions in the AI Act. First to Olivia, because you have the view of also the governance of a company from the ethical point of view, and then from Dan as a data scientist.
Yes.
Rapidly.
Okay, rapidly. So I would say, if you're putting me on the spot here, but I would say actually my biggest concern, I do see that having these laws in place, they're very important. We have both the US, UK, EU all looking towards these laws to govern how we are going to proceed with fairness. My one concern here is actually on the side of startups and SMEs. So I do a lot of work with founders, and I know how little they do governance, and I know how little resources they have to be able to do that governance. And so I hope that with the implementation of the AI Act and the continued implementation of the GDPR, that resources are developed for young companies who want to develop, cutting edge technology, but keep it fair by having resources that they can easily lean on, because these impact assessments and this documentation, it's essential, but it is a large demand when a company is just starting out. So that's my one concern there.
I think the financial point is extremely relevant also for the consultation of groups, because if this stakeholder are consulted and paid by the company who is doing so there is a financing problems in this fairness in practice, right? So there's a lot about that. And Dan, what's your view on this legal discussion from a technical point of view?
So the distinction between large and small, I want to talk to, because I have two ideas for you guys that I haven't seen in a lot of regulation that anyone should be able to do, because I tell my team to do it, and this is like one person at a time. So robustness checks and a pre-analysis plan for these like data science fairness tests. So I mentioned earlier, like, this is everything I'd like to test and this is what I can test. It's still important to kind of move in each direction. So robustness checks look not just at this week, but last week, this group and this group, as much as you can. I think that's a reasonable thing to ask for. Sometimes when you move a little bit, the answer changes in a significant way. Sometimes it doesn't, and both of those are important to know. And then the second one is a pre-analysis plan, which is an idea from the social sciences due to the replication crisis. So precisely because there are so many different reasonable choices you can make, you have a lot of degrees of freedom as a data scientist or as a company to kind of get the conclusion that you want. And so I don't think it's too much to ask, and again, my team wouldn't do a test without doing this. I don't think it's too much to ask to tell data scientists that before they do the fairness test, they lay out what they're going to test, what they're going to control for. Now, you can look at the data and then learn from it and then do more analysis, but that has to be labeled as exploratory analysis. So those are two things I haven't seen much of, but I think would be good to require.
Yeah. Okay.
Just one word, completely true. There's just a difference in the AI Act between provider level, so the companies who are developing the AI system, and of course they need to do no matter what size they are, but on deployer level, so only companies or actors that are using the AI system, they do not have, they are not changing the AI system or they are not improving robustness. The only things that we as Parliament are saying, for example, is that they are needing to do regular cybersecurity updates and so on. And yeah, but all the other things that you said are in the AI Act one level more up.
Yeah, and there's like this also reflects to the discussion on size versus risks, right? Because there's also this problem. Small companies can produce very high risks also. So the risk-based approach and the size-based approach are not always on the same page. And this is, I think, also the frustration of policymakers, because sometimes we use size as a concept, but then risks doesn't look at sites, right? And you don't want that a startup, if you fly tomorrow and the startup is producing the plane, you don't want it to be like low risk, like not so many duties of accountability because they are small. So this is just to say how complex is all this. Before opening the discussion, I wanted to see if the speakers wanted to react again on some points, because I was rushing a lot because I wanted to make sure that we could arrive at this point. So if you have some more points that you want to comment on the others, or we can see, I'm sure there will be questions. So
yeah, I want to hear the questions.
Yeah, okay. Let's start with the questions. I see already one question. Please.
Hi. Okay. Yeah. Hi, I'm Katharina Körner from the IPP. We conducted a report last year on AI governance and privacy and how those governance approaches can align. So my question is, so in my understanding, there is no free lunch when it comes to bias. So you will always have a trade-off, for example, between bias and accuracy. So, and in this report, actually, we ask a number of companies what the biggest risks are for them, what they see as the biggest risk in AI, and privacy and bias was number one. And then they were like saying, but we don't know what non-bias is. So like, what are the benchmarks for this? So how will we move forward with regulations where we do not really know what is non-bias, and we will never ever have non-bias with perfect accuracy. So how do we deal with those trade-offs?
So yeah, I think you're referring also to the problem of, we don't know what bias is actually, because we don't know, you were saying we are not sure about what are the vulnerable groups that we should consider, the characteristics that we should consider, and also since bias might be implicit in the machine, in the program, in programmer mind, etc. This is a whole, very complex discovery activity. I see maybe Olivia wanted to comment.
Yes, I guess I'll lead this. So it is impossible to completely eliminate bias. That just is impossible. What we're doing instead is we're looking to eliminate unwanted bias. What that means is understanding, based on our knowledge, what is discriminatory, what is harmful bias that we would like to remove from our systems. The reason we can't ever eliminate bias completely is bias is a preference. It is preference of A over B. And in some cases, that preference A over B is harmful. The harmful ones we want to remove. We can't remove everything. That's okay. It's just understanding where that bias and where that preference is and having knock-on actions to ensure that there isn't harm incurred, that it is still fair as it can be for the end users. It's also important to note here that something that is unbiased and fair to one person is not going to be the same for the other person. So you're absolutely right. There are a lot of trade-offs, and a lot of work that ethicists do is actually work on these trade-offs to understand exactly what is the right trade-off, the right balance to be striking in this exact moment, and what are the safeguards that need to be put in place based off of that decision to ensure the safety is still and accuracy is still upheld.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe also to complement. So the Parliament 100% agree from personal side, and also the Parliament saw this problem, and also the Council, so the member states. You saw the proposal by the Commission, because the Commission actually, similar to your question, was falling for that they were believing in, for example, the most infamous example was Article 10 with free of error data sets, complete data sets, and so on and so on. What we all know is not impossible. Council and Parliament changed that, made clear that it's indeed a goal that we want to strive at, but we will never reach it in 100%. And also, luckily, there was a cross-party understanding that we also cannot make everything in AI systems much better than in the human beings. So also human beings have, for example, certain biases and so on. But again, on level of an EU law, it's always very difficult to go into really every detail, let's say. So what we are doing now in our law, based on what was said before, we are really just underlining, let's say, general principles or general directions, and those then need to be clarified and further defined in guidance, in standards, and so on. That has the big advantage, it's going via Article 8 in the AI Act, that it's then specific to the use case and to the sector where the AI system is developed and used.
Yeah.
Just a last comment. I think I don't know how controversial that may be, but I don't think you can aspire to benchmarks when it comes to fair outcomes for individuals, just because fairness is really so context specific. And in certain contexts, in a healthcare context, for example, you may prioritize, false positives, basically. The way you kind of will test your system will vary depending on the kind of risks you're trying to address. So also broadly, fairness as a concept is a contested issue, and I think the best you can do, at least from a data protection solely point of view, is to create a roadmap and explain the decisions you took in the process of developing a system, and that way you can be held accountable and explain to the data subjects why you made those decisions, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. And I think something emerged quite clearly when also Kai was mentioning the problem of human bias and machine bias. And also what I see here, also coming from this table, from this discussion, is that the term of bias was something and then has been growing as an octopus, embedding more and more concepts and problems. Maybe we are all mentioning bias, but some of us are also mentioning injustice, social injustice, that is not going back to the question about trade-off between accuracy and bias. Sometimes might be accurate to discriminate, but it's unjust, and that's fair. It's unfair. So that's why fairness is a better framing than just debiasing. Not only, in my view, now I'm a bit overacting here, but not only because fairness can be also related to power imbalance, to mental manipulation, to many things, but also because of this, because fairness can be also proactive and corrective to social injustices. Of course, this is big, I know. This is very much beyond what the law is trying to do, but as people working with concepts and as a scholar, I think it's interesting to use this concept for this, like social. You wanted to comment? No, I saw your mic. No, because I think it's also interesting to hear from you.
I mean, just really quickly, I thought your question was so thoughtful. And you were talking about the impossibility of getting rid of bias, but like, that's okay. The important thing is having the thoughtful conversations. That's kind of the best we could do. That's okay.
Are there more questions? Yeah? If I can understand just from hands how many questions we have, we still have time, but just to understand. 1, 2, 3. Okay, good.
All right, hi. My name is Victoria Guijarro Santos. I'm a PhD student at the University of Münster in Germany. And I have more or less comments and a question at the end too, so don't worry. And my comment is that I think that bias was just framed as a personal preference. But I think what is important to see is that this personal preference don't just appear from the nowhere, but because there is a lot of knowledge about racism and sexism in the society which is picked up. So at the end, bias and discrimination, you can trace it back to structural racism or sexism or whatsoever, all these social hierarchies in this world. So I'm often wondering what de-biasing means with regards to such a social problem. This is one question. And then the other one was that you from the Uber team just mentioned that it was difficult to classify and categorize persons and that there is a gap in academia addressing it. And I just wanted to fill this gap by pointing to the work of Alex Hanna or Tubuku Suveri from critical race scholars thinking about data and racism. And what they make very clearly is not that the problem of categorization can be solved by self-identification or things like that, but it's also about what are you going to use this information for. So I was wondering if in the Uber team, you also sometimes, in this Uber fairness team, if you sometimes recommend your boss to maybe not use some technologies because they are just harmful in terms of racism or something else. And I was also wondering if in your Uber team you have sociologists or if it's just a data scientist. Thank you.
Thank you. You want to?
Yeah, so my team specifically is all data scientists, economists. There are different teams, so there's a product equity team that focuses on more kind of small end studies, talking to drivers, users who are in historically disfavored groups and understanding how they interact with the product, how the product doesn't always work for them, and trying to improve that. And yeah, no, absolutely there are conversations about whether to do something in the first place. One example, it's not a product thing, but I think we try to be very clear internally about not using protected traits for marketing, for instance, and as there gets to be more advertising on the platform. I think that's sort of low-hanging fruit. But yeah, the conversations definitely do happen. And I think that's part of the reason my team was created, is that so we could put some data to it, start to ask the questions, analyze them. And the data can never be the end of the conversation, but it does help guide it.
Other comments from the panel?
I just found the beginning of the comment quite interesting, and because indeed we live in unequal societies in general, and we have to kind of like acknowledge that. And I have been in roundtables around this issue before, and one of the things we also mentioned in the guidance is that you have to actually identify where the bias kind of like derives, because that's going to be a reality, and you have to make a decision around what elements of the real world you will try to replicate in your model, because you should not take it for a given that whatever patterns you identify in the training data sets or in historical data are patterns you want to kind of like replicate in the future. But yes, all models are biased, basically. It's up to you to decide what you want to achieve in the future, essentially.
And I want to just pick up off of that real quick. It is incredibly difficult for larger companies, especially where they're negotiating essentially between those structural biases that we do see and the risks that they're able to take on. So I think a great example of this is I was speaking with a woman once that was heading up a division that was creating a credit loan algorithm at a fairly large financial institution. Sorry, I'm having to filter myself as I go here. But basically, she sat down and she said, I recognize that this algorithm is bias. I'm seeing bias actually towards single mothers, but we can't actually change anything because of our risk indicators for the bank. We can't take on further risk. And so she was stuck at this crux between, I see this fairness problem, I see this injustice that needs to be corrected, but I'm stuck within in a system that doesn't allow me to actually correct for that. And so she was trying to figure out ways to go about actually looking at that risk indicator and risk appetite of the entire institution to be able to allow to correct for some of that injustice. She had to go with a lot of research and a lot of credentials and a lot of information backing her up to even begin that conversation. So I bring this up only because we can recognize these structural injustices and these biases, but we have to understand that when it comes to implementing change in our institutions, it's not always as simple as we wish it was, where it's one point. It usually goes quite deep that we're looking at. And I don't want to say that to discourage. Like Dan's saying, as long as we're trying, we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, but I think your point was great, also the question, because actually, I think we observe this seduction of correcting everything automatically, like automating corrections, but it's not like that. And maybe here, what is missing at this table is the role of the state. The state should take into account social injustice in a way, and not just demanding to, fairness, bias, check, test, mitigate. Mitigation should be also structural. We should wonder why some people are so high risk, and the state should help them. I mean, this, again, my personal view, but being academic give me all this freedom. So there was another question, right? Maybe other two, yeah.
Hi, my name is Clara, and I'm also from the ICO. So I want to go back to the point that you were making, Gianclaudio, about the wider definition of fairness as wider than just bias, and kind of asking Dan and Olivia from their work what techniques, most on technical or more process side, you've encountered to detect and correct for a wider definition of fairness.
It is a lot harder. And again, the remit of my team was to focus on specifically vulnerable groups. But we are finding that in tackling that specific statistical problem, it does teach us about what to do with the broader problems, but it's an active area, and it's, I think we are working on it and are learning a lot.
So I come from being a philosopher, so I default towards philosophical thought and the practice of critical thinking there. But something that we've done and we've noticed success with is actually creating living definitions of fairness. So instead of setting a definition of fairness and walking away and saying we're done, actually having a process to revise that definition as we learn. So you implement, you learn, and you either tweak or you keep pushing forward. Another aspect that we've used that we've seen success with is actually having what is essentially an overarching definition of fairness, and then specific definitions of fairness per product or per team. Depends on the company, but that often helps of what does fairness look like in this situation, in this scenario. And the last bit, got a little more than you were expecting, I think, out of my answer. But the last bit, when it comes to defining fairness, something that my team does is we look at both the definition or the concept understanding of fairness on the company level, we look at it on the societal level, and we look at it on the regulatory level. So we're triangulating that definition. We're not just looking for one resource. We're actually trying to pull in multiple resources to create a balanced definition that works in a couple different angles.
Yeah, and I think your point really reveals how we can see fairness as a top-down concept or a bottom-up case-based concept. So if there is one fairness or many fairness, it's also how the law regulates, because we have the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive that makes a list of unfair things, so at least you know what's unfair. Then we have GDPR, which is a general principle on fairness, and I think this is interesting to see that there are as many fairness as many cases possibly, depending on considerations. We had at least another question, I guess. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Simone Huting. I'm from the Open University, and hi, my name is Simone Huting. I'm from the Open University, and I'm doing also my PhD research on the fairness principle in European data protection law. So I'm really interested to learn and listen to you in this panel. I was wondering, do you already see differences emerge concerning the meaning of fairness within the GDPR and within the AI Act? Because, they really relate and overlap, but I can also imagine that differences are emerging. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Kai, maybe?
Yeah. It's a very good point, because we are, what I said already in one of my statements, extremely afraid that actually this will happen, that there are not only different member states, but also, I think you said it in between, that, for example, one member state, Sophia was it, one member state is using the data protection authority as national competent authority, another state is using the competition authority, another state like Germany maybe the cybersecurity authority, and all have, of course, extremely different perspective on the things. They are thinking only about safety issues, only about fairness issues when it comes about competition, for example, and so on and so on. So harmonization and coordination there is really key, especially, and this fits also a little bit to several of the previous questions, the AI Act is in this case really unique, because it's the first time you are using a product legislation approach. It's the so-called NLF, New Legislative Framework. And new legislative framework is always based on technical standards, but it was always only protecting health and safety. Now in the AI Act, there is this new element of fundamental rights. And this means that in the future, Senelec, for example, or in Germany, DIN, the National Standardization Organization, needs to decide what is fairness based on the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the EU. They have no clue about it. No? And how do they fix it in the future? There is this extra element of common specifications, which would lead the Commission, or leave the Commission every competence and power to decide on their own. We were pushing back against it from Council side, but also from Parliament side, because the standardization processes are working, but we are worried that civil society in this case needs to be more involved, and they are not involved. Often it's a funding problem, or also a lack of human resources and so on. So it's a very complex topic that you are talking about. It's completely unsolved right now. We have it at least identified that there is a huge risk of different, like you said, different interpretation, different views between laws, but also between member states, between national authorities. And there again, I said it already, I'm a UK fan. What in the UK is working very well, the Turing Institute is now creating, Florian in his AI standardization hub, is creating so-called mirroring groups. And in those groups, civil society is gathering, is able to provide information, experience what is not working and so on. And they themselves have then not the possibilities or the financial means to go to BSI, the standardization organization in the UK or worldwide, to ISO and whatsoever, but the Turing Institute is then sending two representatives that are presenting basically on behalf of civil society actors some input. And I think this is something where the European Union can learn again from the UK how to better involve all kinds of stakeholders in this crucial element of standardization, because once again, this will be really the most important point that decides how do you interpret the AI Act.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just a quick comment. I do believe definitions are really crucial, so we all know what we're talking about. And I think one approach we took in the guidance is that we adopted the terminology algorithmic fairness to differentiate it from the fairness principle. So when we're talking about algorithmic fairness, we're talking about statistical interpretations on fairness that relate to things that you can test, like the work that Dan is doing, for example. And we also have a forum with other 3 UK regulators, which is called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. We're working with the Competition and Markets Authority, the Financial Services Authority, Ofcom on AI policy. And fairness is something that we are all concerned about, but we have different interpretations of it. And I think we have acknowledged and accepted that being complying with the fairness principle of data protection may not necessarily mean that you comply with the fairness principle as the FCA approaches it, and that's fine because these are different regimes essentially. But yes, I mean I'm really in favor of being really precise in terms of what exactly you're talking about when you're talking about fairness or algorithmic fairness or discrimination.
And indeed, I think that this point on different legal frameworks has also an important legal consideration to be done. Fairness is part of the fundamental right to data protection. I see my students of fundamental right course here, and they know that fair is in Article 8 of the Charter. So of course, it has a value that can or cannot be recycled for everything. It's a very, maybe it's in the essence of the law, but I think also a point was raised that it was very interesting. When we have complex concepts, we have this two-sided risks. One is that they keep too abstract to be implemented, like risk to fundamental rights in the GDPR is still very much not done, right? There's cybersecurity analysis in the DPIA and few more things, right? So because it's too abstract. On the other hand, you were mentioning standardization bodies. The AI Act is trying to do a lot on that, and the other risk is technocratization, that we lose a bit the view of first the democratic level, because standardization bodies do not represent society in a way, and also they are technical bodies, right? And so I think that the point here is a participation of, you mentioned the UK case, participation of individuals, because then they can reveal their subjective views on that fair application, fair case, and so at least the social sensitivity on the topic and on the point. We have 2 final minutes that, if we don't have a very final flash question, we can spend for a final statement to the whole panel, unless there is a very flash question at the end. No? So I would like to hear from the panelists, like final 30 seconds each, because on if they want, on this discussion, starting from Kai.
Yeah. I try to keep it really short. So in the end, I have 2 big hopes with the AI Act. First of all, is that we really keep it in this big framework of digital legislations that is now there in the European Union in a balanced and fully harmonized way, because at the moment it's not the case. There are too many laws out there. They are all overlapping, interacting with each other, contradicting each other, and so on. So hopefully we will manage it so that what you were saying several times, in the end, the GDPR, the AI Act, and all the others are really working together, because otherwise not even companies have a problem, but also civil society. And the second thing is that I truly believe that at the end we will find a balanced approach. Again, at the EU level, we cannot go in every detail, but at least with the general principles or general directions, we can make a statement. And there I agree with you. I think we, as European Parliament, after 1 year of a fight, already found a rather pragmatic, balanced approach, and many people were actually surprised, because it's normally not the case that the Parliament is coming with such a proposal, and I hope we keep it.
There's a cocktail hour. Come to it so we could keep talking about this stuff. Please come up and ask me questions.
And we have been hearing bottles being opened in the last time. Maybe you didn't, but we heard. So final comments by Sophia?
I don't want to stop you from getting cocktails. Just one pipe dream of mine. These algorithmic fairness approaches are really good in terms of detecting discrepancies in outcomes, but I think it will be good to start using machine learning to actually identify the root causes of what we see in the data sets, basically. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go real fast. And I'm going to focus on the ethics side. We're at an amazing point in time where we can really actually start to find some of the root causes of these biases and be able to make structural changes, not only in our technology, but in our society. And I'll leave on the point that there is a difference between caring and action. And you can care all you want about something being fair, about fairness in concept, but that won't do anything unless you're taking action. So explore, look, there's many actions you can take, but do something.
Thank you very much. Now I think it's fair to go to the cocktails. Thank you all.